images that immediately come to your mind? Is it that of a well-educated doctor, or perhaps a very wealthy businessman, or a very high-profile, famous pro athlete? You know, there's no doubt that the system that we live in today equates success with money and wealth. In fact, one dictionary even defines success as the attainment of wealth, favor, or eminence. Many others believe that filling their lives with fun and entertainment is the best way of life. They reason, life is short. Get everything that you can out of it. In effect, these pursuers of wealth and pleasure really echo the sentiments of many in Paul's day that said, "Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we are to die." It should be noted, though, that many who are at the pinnacle of this so-called success have something interesting to say to you and I about it. I'd like to read you a famous billionaire by the name of Ross Perot's comments. He's an American who dabbled in politicians, but he has an enormous amount of money. This is what he said about wealth. If you make a lot of money, if you go out and buy a lot of stuff, it's going to break. Things just don't mean happiness. From a billionaire, someone who could buy anything that he wanted. Really, an acknowledgement of the futility of life's typical pursuits. Bible students may hear in these words the inspired thoughts of King Solomon, who said that the pursuit of wealth was like a striving after the wind. You could never catch it. It was pure futility. So then what is the real life? And how is it that you and I can reach out for it, so to speak? Well, Paul used this expression in 1 Timothy 6. You might want to put a marker in 1 Timothy 6. We're going to be using this chapter of the Bible quite extensively today. But to start off with, we're going to read verses 17 through 19 of 1 Timothy 6. So 1 Timothy 6, verses 17 through 19 reads this way. Instruct those who are rich in the present system of things not to be arrogant, and to place their hope not on uncertain riches, but on God, who richly provides us with all the things we enjoy. Tell them to work at good, to be rich in fine works, to be generous, ready to share, safely treasuring up for themselves a fine foundation for the future, so that they may get a firm hold on the real life. To fully understand Paul's counsel here, we need to have a little bit of background knowledge about the place to which he was writing to, which is ancient Ephesus, and Timothy being at that place. Excavations of this ancient ruin have revealed Ephesus to have once been a place of wealth and influence. In fact, one house that they excavated there, among the first, illustrated just how wealthy the Ephesians were. Some of them, anyway. They had a footprint, this house did, of about 10,000 square feet. That's probably in 5 or 6 times more than what you and I might have if we're doing fairly well for ourselves today. And there's evidence that this 10,000 square foot footprint had a second floor. So this was truly a mansion. Now, typically at the center of this house was a courtyard with a running fountain, open air. So you could visualize how beautiful that could have been. There could have been gardens there. And all the other rooms were sort of centered around this atrium. They had fantastic wall frescoes, paintings, and from the floor right to the ceiling, and mosaics, stone that was made into pictures on their floor. The Ephesians had technology in their homes for running water and heating. In town, in Ephesus, there were 2 different theaters. A smaller, more intimate one called the Odeon, and a large one that could accommodate up to 25,000 people. For sports fans, there was a huge stadium that could seat 70,000 people. They had baths with cold, warm, and hot rooms, built with a heating system known as the hypocaust, which involved the passage of hot air beneath the floor. You know, when Brother Kobach came and did some work on my house, I asked him about in-floor heating and said, Brett, he said to me, Brett, you're just an average guy. You can't afford in-floor heating. Even today, that's sort of a luxury, isn't it? They had saunas, which they heated using jets of hot steam emitted through the slits cut into brick columns. Because Ephesus was a major port, goods from all over the world were there too. And you could go to an open-air market called the Agora and purchase anything that your heart desired. Ephesus was also known for its library, its schools, and its political power. In fact, for a good portion of the end of the 1st century, it was favored with the title of Neokoros, or the favored city of the emperor of Rome at the time. He had in fact installed his own temple so that he could worship there. It was additionally one of 3 cities in the world at that time which was lit at night by lamps. Rich? Yes. Arrogant? Assuredly. We can see why Paul counseled Timothy to give the counsel that he did to the Ephesians in verse 17. Instruct those who are rich in the present system of things not to be arrogant, and to place their hope not on uncertain riches, but on God, who richly provides us with all the things that we enjoy. See, these riches, no matter how vast they were uncertain. They were temporary. If they wanted a real life, the real life and a real hope for the future, they had to build a fine relationship with God. However, not all of the Ephesians were wealthy. In fact, up to 50 years ago, the Watchtower cited the fact that 50% of the entire Roman Empire were in fact slaves. Some sources say that wealthy families in the Roman Empire could have had up to 2,000 slaves. Can you imagine? So really, when we start to visualize a place like Ephesus, which was a hotspot of wealth and influence, we could get the idea in the sense that there was much more than half the population there in Ephesus that were in fact in this situation. They were slaves. Then we start to visualize what that congregation in Ephesus might have been. Who often are the ones that respond to the good news when we take it to them? Very often, it's those that are in some way disadvantaged by the system that we live in. So we could actually visualize the fact that the majority of our brothers and sisters who lived there in Ephesus were in fact slaves. In fact, a careful examination of the Greek scriptures confirms that there were many brothers in this situation. 1 Timothy 6 is actually an example of Paul addressing these brothers through Timothy. And if you just flip your page back to verse 2, we won't read it, but you can actually verify the fact that this was the case here in 1 Timothy 6. Well, in the Roman Empire, slaves had absolutely no rights. If you were caught stealing, you were killed. If you ran away, you were killed. Now imagine you being in a situation where you were perhaps quite well off, living somewhere, and in came the soldiers, took you away, you are now a slave. Perhaps you were running a business. Maybe you had some of life's good things, all gone. Now imagine being taken to Ephesus and being surrounded by all this wealth, all this prominence. What would be the natural inclination of a person in that situation? You'd want it, wouldn't you? Would you start yearning and desiring these material things? Almost assuredly. Now, turn back with me to verse 9. And with this situation firmly in our minds, let's read it together. 1 Timothy 6, starting from verse 9, says, "But those who are determined to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many senseless and hurtful desires that plunge men into destruction and ruin. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of injurious things. And by reaching out for this love, some have been led astray from the faith and have stabbed themselves all over with many pains. However, you, O man of God, flee from these things, but pursue righteousness, godly devotion, faith, love, endurance, and mildness. Fight the fine fight of the faith. Get a firm hold on the everlasting life for which you were called, and you offered the fine public declaration in front of many witnesses. For our first century brothers and sisters in Ephesus, the love of money was very dangerous. In fact, as we've discussed, it could even cost them their lives. But this wouldn't even be the worst thing that could happen to our brothers and sisters there. Did you notice what verse 10 said about this love of money? It says that by reaching out for that love, some had been led astray from the faith. Well, why was this worse? Because as verse 12 reminds us, it's only when we're fighting the fine fight of the faith that we can get a firm hold on the everlasting life for which you were called. Herein lies the major difference between the world's view of the real life and what the Bible offers and holds out as the real life. Jehovah is offering everlasting life, whereas everything in the world around us is temporary. We see the truth of this when we examine 1 John 2, verse 15 through 17. I'll keep a finger or a marker there in 1 Timothy 6. We're going to be coming back to it. But let's flip over as well for a moment to 1 John 2, verse 15 through 17. We're going to take a good look at this scripture today. It says, "Do not love either the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Because everything in the world, the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, and the showy display of one's means of life, it does not originate with the Father, but originates with the world. Furthermore, the world is passing away, and so is its desire. But the one who does the will of God remains forever." Today, none of us are literal slaves like our brothers and sisters were in Ephesus. But is it possible, brothers and sisters, that we could become enslaved to the desire of the flesh, or the desire of the eyes, or the showy display of one's means of life? Brothers and sisters, has this become your master? You find yourself working long hours to sustain a lifestyle that we really can't afford. You know, when my wife had a study with a family some years back, a really nice family, they had a nice house up in Markham, a couple of kids. The husband was never home. And we found out later that he was working 3 jobs to sustain what he had working there. 20 hours a day he was working. He'd come home, crash on his bed for a few hours, get up, and start it all over again. That's not the real life. That is literally modern day slavery today. In fact, you know, it's doubtful that their masters would ever have worked the Ephesian slaves that hard, because they realized that at some point it was completely counterproductive. And you know, it's interesting that the rich are as prone to these traps as you and I might be. Perhaps some of you are familiar with this article, this magazine. You've seen it on newsstands. It's Toronto Life. And a few years back, I thought there was a very interesting article that I'd like to share with you some of the excerpts of this article, Going for Broke. But before we do, we'd like to remember the context of what Paul's words to Timothy and the Ephesians were, and how he was talking about sustenance and covering, and being content with just that, sustenance and covering. So, Toronto's got to be an expensive place to live, hasn't it? But probably many of us in our audience would agree that $100,000 would be enough to support our families in terms of sustenance and covering. Many of us would probably wish we were making that much. So now imagine having double that. Would that be enough? Imagine making $400,000. Would that be enough? Well, it's interesting that this article speaks of a man, his name is Richard, and he made $800,000 a year. Now that's more than most of us would be making, certainly, and certainly something well beyond what we would imagine being a level just to support our sustenance and covering. But was it enough? I'd like to read you, and for you mathematicians, see if you can keep a running total in your head of Richard's accounts on a yearly and annual basis. So, after taxes, this man made $440,000. So, the government loves it when you make lots of money too, because so do they. Now let's start talking about his expenses. He had a Rosedale home with, at the time, a 7-figure mortgage that was costing him $150,000 a year. Then his kids went to private school. $70,000 a year for private school. His Georgian Bay cottage, which he owned outright, nevertheless cost him $40,000 a year to maintain. Then car payments and lease payments on his Mercedes and his wife's Jag, $30,000 a year. And of course there's insurance for all these fine items, another $25,000 a year. There were clothes, annually $75,000 every year to clothe his family. Dinners out at Toronto's best restaurants, a couple of times a week, $30,000. Groceries, $1,200 a month. Starting to get the picture here. $25,000 for a 2-week vacation to Antigua. Donations, $20,000 a year. And to top it off, poor Barney, the golden retriever, the family's golden retriever, needed a $4,000 hip replacement. And he was paying $8,000 a year for professional membership for clubs and so on, where he was able to make his business contacts. So did anyone get sort of a running total? It's okay if you didn't, you lost track a little bit. The truth is, this man is deficit budgeting by tens of thousands of dollars every year. You see, when you're rich, that desire of the eyes just grows. You always need more. It just continues to grow. We all think, if we made just a little bit more, we'd be okay. But that desire of the eyes is like a disease that can get inside you and just take complete control of you. And that is the elegance of Satan's trap. See, whether you're struggling to make ends meet, working 2 jobs, and just barely getting by, or you're like Richard, making all kinds of money hands over fist, it can still get a hold of us. The same article contained an outrageous example of the showy display of one's means of life. Another thing that John mentioned there at 1 John 2. I'd like to read you an excerpt again from the same article. Now notice the reasoning and what it leads to. If you have two real estate agents, one pulls up in a Mercedes and the other pulls out in a rusted out old VW, and your house is for sale, who are you going to give the listing to, or trust the biggest investment of your life? Well, the answer seems obvious, doesn't it? You've got to have a sweet ride to be anybody in this city. And there's a man that sort of caught on to that and realized that there's a lot of people that would take something like that without really being able to afford it. So he started a business called the GTA Exotic Car and Motorcycle Rental that's located out by Queensway and Islington. And it caters to anyone who wants to have the car but doesn't have the money. You can actually go and rent a Ferrari or a Mercedes for the day. I believe the Mercedes is pretty cheap. You can buy that one for $150 just for the day. And $600 would get you a Ferrari for the day. Now, what was the point of this? Well, the article says that the rental shop is less than 3 years old, but already its owner says that he roughly leases about his entire fleet every weekend, and he generates most of his business from return clients who've learned from experience that image goes a long way. You can rent a Ferrari for the same price as a limousine for a couple of hours. And people assume that you own the Ferrari, but they know you don't own the limo. So when you pull up to an event and you're driving a special vehicle, it's total status, unquote. And the article goes on to comment, it says, cars matter in Toronto. There's much auto ostentation in this town. Spend a Saturday night in Yorkville, and the parade is comical. One imported luxury sports car after another, none of which exceeds a speed of 15 kilometers per hour. They don't want to blow the dust off your shoes. They want to go real slow, so you get a good mental picture of them driving by in their sweet ride. Yeah, showy display of one's means of life. What about this aspect of the desire of the flesh? Well, today, addiction is an ugly word that we become quite familiar with. Whether it's addiction to pornography, addiction to sex, addiction to alcohol or drugs, there's a rehab center for everything, isn't there? Why? Because people are literally enslaved to these three elements that John has spoken about, and they simply can't break free. And it's all for nothing. You remember what it said there at the end? The world is passing away. So are all its desires. How is it that you and I can avoid these traps? How is it that we can reach out for the real life? Well, let's return to 1 Timothy 6 and consider the counsel that Paul gave again through Timothy to those Ephesians in that congregation. We're going to look at 3 different ways that you and I can reach out for the real life. But let's reread 18 and 19. First Timothy 6, verse 18 and 19 says, tell them to work it good, to be rich in fine works, to be generous, ready to share, safely treasuring up for themselves a fine foundation for the future, so that they may get a hold on the real life. Well, what does it mean to be rich in fine works? Well, one aspect is, if we're learning the truth, to fully accept the ransom by dedicating our life to Jehovah and getting baptized. It all needs to be built on the foundation of learning and study. We need to focus on spiritual things, because make no mistake, there is a war for our heart today. Satan is fighting for your and my mind and heart. So we've been getting a lot of counsel on personal study lately, haven't we? We've even got a night now that we're supposed to dedicate to our family and the worship and maintaining that. That really is the foundation of getting a firm hold on the real life. Now let's look at 3 specific ways that we can maintain that hold. The main work that we do as Christians today, because Paul emphasizes there the need to be rich in fine works, is our ministry, the preaching work. Can we really say that our spirit in this work is generous, that we're ready to share? You know, despite the difficult circumstances that our brothers and sisters were in Ephesus, that was the case for them. Go back to verse 12 for a moment, where they were being encouraged to get a firm hold on the everlasting life. You see that, to which you were called. And it says, after that, and you offered the fine public declaration in front of many witnesses. Yes, despite the difficult circumstances that these brothers were in, They were rich in fine works, and they were generous and ready to share this most important message. And today, many of Jehovah's Witnesses have the same spirit and are placing their full trust in Jehovah. There's an interesting case of a sister by the name of Margarita Koniger. And this is what she had to say looking back on her life. She says, "I have never regretted the decision to use my life in Jehovah's service. I could have pursued a materially rewarding career, but I hold this as nothing to compare with the privilege of helping people to learn the truth about God's grand purposes." Do you feel her contentment and the happiness with the choices that she's made in her life? "I hold the material career that I could have had as nothing to compare with the privilege of helping people." Yes, in her words, we can see the satisfaction and reflect being free of the slavery to Satan's world. Point number 1, to be rich in fine works, our ministry. Let's look at number 2, which we're going to talk about as prayer today. Jehovah is ready to help his servants to avoid Satan's pitfalls. And that is one of the main reasons that he's provided the privilege of prayer, to assist us in this fine fight for the faith. Because the pressure to give in to this world's desires is constant and relentless, our prayer needs to be that way too, to counteract this pressure. In the model prayer, Jesus asked God not to bring us into temptation, but to deliver us from the wicked one. Well, we know that Jehovah doesn't tempt us with evil things, but sometimes the Bible speaks of Jehovah doing something when he merely allows it. But with Jehovah's help, we can be confident that he will not allow us to be tested beyond what we can bear. And he provides warnings like the ones that we've talked about today in 1 John and 1 Timothy 6, so that we can avoid these traps and be delivered from the wicked one. Of course, we must do our part too. Once we've prayed about a certain test, to avoid situations where temptations might arise to us.